The coral on Peleliu didn't just cut you, it devoured you. It was 07:30 on September 18, 1944, and the sun was already a physical weight on my back, pressing me into the jagged volcanic crust of the island. I was Private First Class Arthur Jackson, 19 years old, and I was pressing my face into the dirt to keep it from being blown off. To my left, the air snapped and hissed. I flinched as the wet, tearing sound of high-velocity rounds slamming into meat reached my ears. Another Marine down, another scream cut short. We had been on this godforsaken rock for 3 days, and I had exactly 0 confirmed kills to show for the terror that had hollowed out my gut. The Japanese weren't fighting like men. They were fighting like ghosts, entombed in concrete. Ahead of us, the enemy had constructed a nightmare. It was a half-moon arc of reinforced concrete pillboxes, 12 of them, studding the southern peninsula like tumorous growths. We weren't fighting soldiers in the open anymore. We were fighting geometry. We were fighting engineering. Each one of those bunkers housed anywhere from 5 to 35 enemy soldiers, waiting in the dark with their fingers on the triggers of heavy machine guns. Just 3 days ago, the brass had promised us a walkover. Major General William Rupertus, safely aboard his command ship, had told the 1st Marine Division that we would secure this island by the weekend. It was supposed to be a 4-day operation, a quick cleanup. He was wrong. He was tragically, lethally wrong. By the time we were done, his 4-day estimate would stretch into 70 days of hell. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the heat, the flies, and the smell of blood drying on the coral. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had changed the rules of war. There were no more banzai charges, no more screaming suicidal rushes into the teeth of our machine guns, where we could mow them down in heaps. Nakagawa had built a fortress. 10,000 defenders were waiting for us in caves and bunkers, connected by 500 yards of subterranean tunnels. They didn't come to us. They let us walk into the meat grinder. By this morning, the 1st Marine Regiment, the poor bastards who went in first, had taken 70% casualties. 7 out of every 10 men were dead or bleeding out on the beach. Now it was our turn, the 7th Marines, Regiment. Our mission sounded simple enough on paper. Clear the Japanese defensive positions blocking the advance toward the airfield. But paper doesn't bleed. The problem was the pillboxes. They were masterpieces of defensive fortification. Japanese engineers had dug them into the coral ridges, reinforcing them with walls of concrete 3 feet thick. They were mutually supporting, meaning each pillbox had overlapping fields of fire with its neighbors. If you attacked one, 2 others would cut you to ribbons from the flanks. We had tried everything. We threw grenades, but they just bounced off the sloping concrete walls and detonated harmlessly in the dirt. We fired our rifles until the barrels smoked, but the bullets just sparked against the gray stone and ricocheted away. We tried rushing the gun slits, charging headlong into the fire, but the bodies just piled up. My platoon had managed to advance 200 yards this morning before our left flank stalled completely. A massive pillbox dominated the approach, a concrete monster that spat death every time a Marine twitched. We were stuck. We couldn't move forward, and we couldn't retreat. 3 of my buddies had already died trying to find a flank. The standard Marine Corps solution for a nut this hard to crack was to call in the heavy metal, tanks, or artillery, but Peleliu was laughing at us. The terrain in this sector was a twisted maze of steep coral ridges and narrow draws. Tanks couldn't maneuver here without throwing a track or exposing their thin belly armor. Artillery was useless. The enemy was too close, and dropping shells on the pillbox meant killing the Marines pinned down right in front of it. That left only one option. The option nobody wanted to talk about. The option that meant death. Someone had to cross 150 yards of open ground, get within arm's reach of that pillbox, and destroy it by hand. The Japanese inside had a perfect view. They had machine guns, rifles, and grenades, and they were watching the kill zone. I lay there doing the math in my head. It was brutal arithmetic. A man running across open ground in full gear moves at roughly 15 yards per second if he's fast. Crossing 150 yards meant 10 full seconds of exposure. The Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, the Woodpecker, fired 450 rounds per minute. In those 10 seconds, a single gun could put 75 bullets into the air. That pillbox had at least 2 of them. No Marine could survive that. The officers knew it. The sergeants knew it. I knew it. But as I lay there, feeling the sharp coral digging into my ribs, I knew something else. Every minute we stayed pinned down, another man died. The left flank was the linchpin. If we didn't move, the entire regimental advance would collapse. Waiting for a miracle was just a slower way of dying. I looked at my Browning automatic rifle. It was heavy, scarred, and familiar. I pulled the bolt back, ejected the half-spent magazine, and slammed a fresh 20-round box into the well. I checked my pockets, stuffing them with every grenade I could beg, borrow, or steal from the men around me. I looked at that 150 yards of open coral. The morning sun was beating down, climbing past 100 degrees, baking the fear right into my skin. I took a deep breath of the superheated air, tasting the dust and the cordite. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't look at my sergeant. I didn't coordinate with the squad on my right. I just stood up. The bar weighed 19 pounds fully loaded. It wasn't a sprinting weapon, but today it had to be. I carried it at hip level, the walnut stock tucked tight against my side, and I ran. I moved into the sunlight, a lone figure sprinting across the bleached white coral. The response was instantaneous. The Japanese in the pillbox saw me the moment I broke cover. The Type 92s swiveled, their barrels traversing to track me. Bullets cracked past my head, snapping like bullwhips. Coral chips exploded around my boots, stinging my legs like angry hornets. The air filled with the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of enemy automatic weapons. I squeezed the trigger. The bar roared, bucking against my hip. It fired 30 .06 rounds at a rate of 550 per minute. Firing from the hip while running is inaccurate, but I wasn't trying to thread a needle. I was trying to create a wall of lead. Volume was the point. Suppression was the survival mechanism. I swept the muzzle back and forth across the pillbox's firing slit, raking the concrete. My bullets couldn't penetrate 3 feet of reinforced rock, but they sparked and whined through the aperture, forcing the Japanese gunners to duck. Those seconds, those precious fleeting seconds, were the only reason I was still breathing. The distance closed, 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards. My weapon suddenly clicked dry. The slide locked back. Silence, relative and terrifying, rushed in. I dropped behind a jagged coral boulder, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands shook as I ripped the empty magazine out and slammed a fresh one home, racking the slide. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. If I stayed here, they would zero in on the rock and blow me apart. I stood up and ran again. The gunners had recovered. The fire was thicker now, angrier. Bullets kicked up dust inches from my boots, tugging at my utility uniform. 40 yards, 30, 20. At close range, the geometry shifted. The same firing slits that gave the Japanese such excellent fields of fire at a distance severely limited their angles up close. They couldn't depress the barrels enough to hit me. I reached the blind spot directly beside the main aperture, gasping for air, my lungs burning in the humid heat. I was so close I could hear them inside, shouting in Japanese, the clatter of metal on concrete. They knew I was there, but they couldn't see me. I reached into my pocket. I had carried more than just lead. I had brought white phosphorus grenades, Willie Pete, and behind me, keeping low, another Marine had crawled up with a satchel charge containing 40 pounds of plastic explosive. I grabbed a phosphorus grenade, pulled the pin, and watched the spoon fly off. White phosphorus burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It ignites on contact with oxygen, and water only makes it burn hotter. I shoved the grenade through the firing slit and flattened myself against the wall. The screaming started immediately. It was a sound that stays with you forever. Human beings realizing they are burning from the inside out. Japanese soldiers stumbled out of the rear exit and the side openings, their uniforms smoking, flames eating at their skin. Their ammunition belts began to cook off in the heat, bullets exploding around their waists like strings of firecrackers. I raised the bar and cut them down. It was mechanical. It was necessary. I shot them as they emerged, dropping them before they could raise their weapons. But the pillbox was huge. 35 men were inside. The phosphorus wouldn't get them all. Some retreated deeper into the bunkers, and others were already returning fire through secondary slits. I turned to the satchel charge. 40 pounds of composition C2. I set the 30-second time fuse, my fingers slick with sweat and grime. I had one chance. I shoved the entire heavy package through the main firing slit, right into the gut of the beast. Then I ran. I didn't sprint. I dove. I threw myself into a nearby shell crater, curling into the fetal position, burying my head in my arms, pressing every inch of my body against the earth. The explosion felt like the world had cracked in half. The ground heaved violently, lifting me into the air before slamming me back down. A shock wave of overpressure punched the air from my lungs. Concrete, heavy logs, and body parts were hurled 60 feet into the sky. Debris rained down on my crater, rocks, metal, dust. A chunk of concrete the size of a football slammed into the dirt inches from my head. I lay there for a moment, waiting for the ringing in my ears to subside, spitting grit out of my mouth. When the dust settled, the pillbox was gone. It wasn't just damaged, it was erased. 35 Japanese soldiers were dead. I stood up, my knees shaking, my uniform torn. I was alive. I looked back at my lines. Then I looked forward. 200 yards ahead, 11 more pillboxes were still pouring fire into the Marine advance. The logical thing, the sane thing, was to go back. I had done my job. I could report success and let someone else handle the rest. But logic doesn't apply to Peleliu. I reloaded my bar. I patted my pockets, checking my remaining grenades. I turned my back on my platoon and started walking toward the next pillbox. The second position was 80 yards to the northwest. It was smaller, probably housing 5 men, with 2 machine guns covering the narrow approach. I had lost the element of surprise. The explosion had been a dinner bell for every Japanese soldier in the sector. They had seen their main bunker disappear in a column of smoke. They knew an American was coming, and they were waiting. But I had an advantage now. I was in their network. I used the terrain, moving through the natural channels created by the coral ridges. I had spent 3 days studying how they fought, and I understood their blind spots. I approached the second bunker from its eastern flank, where the jagged rock formations rose to block the angle of their firing slits. I couldn't run this time. I dropped to my belly and crawled the last 30 yards, dragging the heavy bar through the volcanic rock. The coral sliced my elbows and knees, mixing my blood with the dust. The Japanese inside heard the scraping. They began throwing grenades blindly over the bunker wall. These were Type 97 grenades. They had a 4-second fuse. I watched them arc over the concrete, counted the explosions, and waited for the rhythm. Thump, bang, thump, bang. I waited for the pause, then I moved. I scrambled forward, sliding into the dead zone at the base of the bunker wall. I pressed my back against the rough concrete, chest heaving. My phosphorus grenades were gone. I had used them all in the first position. I checked my webbing. I was low on ammo. I was alone. And just on the other side of this wall, 5 men were waiting to kill me. But I had come this far. I wasn't stopping now. I gripped a standard fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and prepared to introduce myself to the neighbors. I held the spoon of the grenade tight against the casing, staring at the concrete wall that separated me from the enemy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed louder than the war raging around me. I had frag grenades left. I still had my Browning automatic rifle, though the wood of the foregrip was smoking, the steel barrel radiating a heat that threatened to sear my skin. I had learned something from that first assault on the large bunker. These Japanese pillboxes were built like tombs, sealed tight against the world, but they all needed to breathe. They had ventilation shafts, small, unsuspecting openings in the roof designed to let the toxic carbon monoxide from their heavy machine guns escape. I realized then that the engineers who built these death traps had made a fatal miscalculation. The shafts were only 4 inches wide. Too small for a grenade, perhaps, unless you had the aim of a pitcher in the World Series, but they were not too small for a rifle barrel. I moved. I scrambled up the side of the bunker, my boots slipping on the crushed coral and loose rock. I felt exposed, a silhouette against the harsh Pacific sky, waiting for a bullet to tear through me. But the fire was directed outward, toward my platoon pinned down in the sand. I reached the roof, a flat slab of concrete baking in the sun. I scanned the surface until I found it, the ventilation shaft. It was a dark, jagged mouth exhaling the acrid stench of cordite. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the muzzle of the bar deep into the opening, angling it downward. I squeezed the trigger and didn't let go. The weapon bucked against my shoulder, spitting fire into the hole. I emptied the entire 20-round magazine straight down into the gut of the beast. The sound was horrifying. A muffled metallic clatter as 30-caliber rounds ricocheted inside the concrete box at supersonic speeds. It was a blender of lead and dust. I could hear screams, sharp and sudden, then silence. I reloaded, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins like rocket fuel. I fired again, 20 more rounds into the darkness below, just to be sure. When I finally pulled the smoking barrel from the shaft and dropped back to the scorched earth, the silence from inside was absolute. That was 2 pillboxes down. 10 remained. The geography of hell is measured in inches and angles. The 3rd and 4th positions were a nightmare of defensive engineering. They sat close together, mutually supporting, like 2 boxers standing back to back. Each bunker's firing arc covered the approach to the other. It was standard Japanese doctrine. Kill the men attacking your neighbor. I couldn't assault one without being cut in half by the guns of the other. I crouched behind a coral head, wiping sweat and grime from my eyes, studying the angles. I solved the problem with geometry. The 2 bunkers faced southwest, their black eyes fixated on the marine lines. Their firing slits swept a 120-degree arc, but directly between them there was a seam, a narrow corridor no wider than a hallway back home, maybe 8 feet, where neither bunker could bring its heavy weapons to bear. It was a suicide run. A man would have to move through that gap perfectly straight, veer 6 inches to the left or right, and you'd catch bullets from one side or the other. I took a breath that tasted of sulfur and rot. Then I ran. I hit that corridor at a full sprint, my boots pounding the hard-packed earth. The air on either side of me snapped and hissed as rounds chewed up the ground, but I was in the eye of the storm. I moved so fast the defenders couldn't traverse their guns in time. I reached the third bunker before they could adjust. I slammed the bar into the firing slit, the metal screeching against concrete, and held the trigger down until the magazine clicked empty. I grabbed my last fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin with my teeth, and tossed it through the aperture like a fastball. The explosion was a dull whoomp that shook the ground beneath my feet. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I pivoted and moved to the fourth bunker, repeating the violent ritual. 4 pillboxes destroyed. Approximately 55 enemy soldiers are dead. I had been fighting for less than 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. My ammunition was critically low. The bar had jammed twice already from overheating. The mechanism was sluggish, choked with dust and heat. The barrel was so hot it had burned my hands through the wooden foregrip, leaving my palms raw and blistered. I had no more grenades, no more explosives. A logical man, a sane man, would have stopped. He would have fallen back, signaled for a runner, and waited for resupply. But as I wiped the stinging sweat from my eyes, I looked back the way I had come. Through the drifting smoke and pulverized coral dust, I saw them. Marines, my platoon. They were beginning to move forward. My attack was working. The left flank was advancing, rising from the sand like ghosts. If I stopped now, the remaining 8 pillboxes would shift their fire. They would pin those men down exactly as they had pinned us down an hour earlier. I knew the math. If I stopped, more men, my friends, would die in front of those concrete walls. I checked my pouches, 3 magazines, 60 rounds, 8 bunkers remaining. The arithmetic was impossible. It was a death sentence. But I wasn't fighting for math anymore. I was fighting for the guys behind me. I started moving. The 5th pillbox was a different beast. It was larger than the previous 3, though not as massive as the first. But this one had a feature the others lacked, something I hadn't anticipated. The Japanese engineers had learned from our tactics. They knew Marines liked to flank, to get in close where the heavy guns couldn't reach. So they had built escape routes, tunnels connecting the pillboxes to rear trenches. I didn't know about the tunnel. I approached the 5th bunker using the same tactics that had kept me alive so far. Find the blind spot, close the distance, kill everything inside. I reached the bunker wall and pressed my back against the warm concrete, preparing to climb. A Japanese soldier rose out of the ground 5 yards behind me. The rear tunnel exit had been perfectly camouflaged with coral rocks and woven palm fronds. I had walked right past it. The soldier emerged like a demon from the earth, a bayonet fixed to his Arisaka rifle, the steel glinting in the sun. He didn't shout, he just lunged at my back. Some instinct, some primal alarm bell made me spin. I fired from the hip. The bar bucked wildly, the .30 caliber rounds hammering the soldier in the chest. He collapsed backwards into his own tunnel entrance, his rifle clattering against the stone. But the noise had given me away. I heard shouting from inside the bunker, the scuff of hobnailed boots on concrete. I had seconds before more of them poured out of that hole. I dropped to one knee, ignoring the pain in my shins, and fired directly into the tunnel mouth. The narrow passage acted like a funnel. My bullets didn't just hit the walls. They ricocheted and traveled, turning the tunnel into a slaughterhouse. I burned through an entire magazine in 4 seconds. I slammed in my second-to-last mag and kept firing until the screaming stopped. When the smoke cleared, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the tunnel. The 5th pillbox had gone silent. 5 down, 7 remaining. But the dynamic of the battlefield had shifted. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy knew where I was. They knew my tactics, and they had radios. Somewhere deep in the island's interior, a commander was looking at a map, realizing that a single American was dismantling his southern perimeter. Orders were being shouted, fire was being concentrated. I didn't know that runners were moving through the tunnel networks. I didn't know that I had been marked for death by every officer in the sector. All I knew was the sound of the advance. To my right, I could hear the distinct crack thump of M1 Garands. I could hear sergeants screaming orders. The Japanese line was fragmenting. They were reacting to us now, no longer controlling the tempo. The 6th pillbox was a fortress on a hill. It sat on a coral ridge 15 feet higher than the surrounding terrain, giving its gunners a commanding view of the battlefield. They could see me coming from 200 yards away. There were no blind spots here, no geometry to exploit. The terrain was stripped bare. I had 1 magazine left, 20 rounds. Then a miracle happened. A Marine rifle squad appeared on my right. 6 dirty, exhausted men who had pushed through the gap I'd created. Their sergeant looked at me, crouched behind a boulder. He looked at the elevated bunker. He saw the impossible situation. He didn't radio for instructions. He simply pointed his weapon at the bunker and led his men forward. It was raw courage. The squad drew the fire. The Japanese gunners, faced with 2 threats, chose the larger one. They swung their weapons toward the 6 Marines. It was the distraction I needed. I scrambled up the blind side of the coral ridge, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I reached the roof, found the vent, and shoved my barrel in. 20 rounds, my last magazine. I made every bullet count. The 6th pillbox fell silent. I slid down the ridge, collapsing next to the squad. They had taken casualties, 2 wounded, 1 dead, but they were still moving. I looked at my empty weapon. I looked at the 6 remaining pillboxes stretching out in the distance. I was dry. I needed ammo. I needed grenades. I looked around the battlefield at the carnage left in the wake of the advance. The dead were my supply depot now. Japanese rifles were useless to me. Their Arisaka ammunition wouldn't fit my American weapon, but grenades were universal. I crawled among the bodies near the 6th pillbox, scavenging like a desperate animal. I found 7 Type 97 fragmentation grenades. I found 2 Type 99 magnetic mines, heavy discs designed to blow the tracks off Sherman tanks. I couldn't find any bar magazines, but near the 3rd bunker I found a fallen Marine's M1 Garand. It held a clip of 8 rounds, 30 caliber, the same round my bar fired. I sat in the dirt, sheltered by a ridge of coral, and began the tedious work of survival. I popped the rounds out of the Garand clips one by one. My fingers were bloody and clumsy as I hand-loaded the loose cartridges into my empty bar magazines. Thumb, click, slide, thumb, click, slide. It was agonizingly slow. The sounds of battle were getting louder, closer. I managed to scrounge enough for 40 rounds, 2 full magazines. The rifle squad was reorganizing. Their sergeant had taken a hit in the shoulder. His tunic was dark with blood, but he was still functional, still using hand signals to direct his men. 3 Marines remained combat effective. We were a ragtag force, battered and bleeding, but we were the spearhead. We were preparing to assault the 7th pillbox when the ground shook, a counterattack. 40 Japanese soldiers emerged from a tunnel entrance 200 yards north. They didn't charge, screaming banzai like in the movies. This was a disciplined maneuver. They moved in 2 columns, rifles at the high port, navigating the coral ridges with professional lethality. They were fresh troops, likely a reserve force sent to plug the hole I had punched in their line. Their objective was clear: seal the breach and kill the Marine who caused it. The squad saw them first. The barman next to me opened up, but his weapon jammed after 3 rounds. The fine coral dust was the enemy of precision machinery. He cursed, dropping behind cover to clear the stoppage. There was a gap in our fire. The Japanese column accelerated, sensing the weakness. I stepped into the breach. I braced my weapon against a rock, ignored the searing heat of the barrel against my hand, and sighted in on the lead officer. I had 40 hand-loaded rounds and a bag full of enemy grenades. I took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked against my shoulder, the heavy steel butt plate digging into the bruise that had been forming for hours. 5 rounds. Pause. The brass casing spun away into the blinding white dust, glittering like fool's gold. 5 rounds. Pause. I could not afford to waste a single ounce of lead. Every bullet had to find meat or bone. The Japanese formation in front of us scattered like a hive kicked over. I saw soldiers dive behind jagged coral boulders, their khaki uniforms blending perfectly with the scorched earth. Others pushed forward, screaming, trying to close the distance before my magazine ran dry. Their return fire intensified, a hornet's nest of snapping noises. Bullets cracked overhead, shattering the silence and the stone alike. Razor-sharp coral fragments sprayed my face, cutting into my cheeks, but I didn't blink. I couldn't. The 3 Marines beside me added their garands to the fight. The rhythm was distinct, the heavy boom-boom-boom of the semi-automatics, followed by the distinctive ping of empty en-bloc clips ejecting, a sound that punctuated the chaos like a dinner bell for death. Japanese soldiers fell in the open, 10, then 15, their bodies crumpling onto the sharp rocks. But more kept coming. They had the numbers, they had the discipline, and they had orders to retake this ground at any cost, orders written in blood. My first magazine ran dry. The bolt locked back. I dropped the empty box, grabbed my last 20 rounds, and slammed the fresh magazine home. The metal was hot enough to blister skin. The other Marines were down to their final clips. The squad's barman had finally cleared his jam, cursing the dust, but he shouted that he had only 1 magazine remaining. The mathematics of war had turned against us again. It was a cold, hard equation. 4 Americans with perhaps 60 rounds between them against 25 Japanese soldiers who were still advancing, bayonets fixed, eyes dead set on our throats. Then the coral ridge behind the Japanese line erupted. The ground shook as grenades detonated in rapid succession. The 7th Marines had pushed 3 rifle platoons through the gaps I had created earlier. 40 men armed with rifles, bars, and grenades had circled behind the Japanese counterattack force like wolves. They had waited for the perfect moment, the moment when the enemy was fully committed to killing us. That moment was now. The Japanese found themselves caught between the anvil and the hammer. My 3 Marines and I were the anvil. 40 fresh killers were the hammer. The crossfire was devastating. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters, cut down from both sides. Some tried to retreat to their tunnel entrance, desperate to escape the kill zone. But the Marines behind them cut them down before they could reach the safety of the earth. In less than 3 minutes, the counterattack was over. 40 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the bleached coral, their bodies twisted in the grotesque shapes of violent death. The southern perimeter's last reserve was gone. The immediate threat had been liquidated, but silence on Peleliu was just a deception. It was never truly quiet. 6 pillboxes remained, and now finally I had ammunition. A runner from the 7th tossed me bandoliers. I had grenades, heavy and reassuring, in my pockets. I had 40 Marines ready to follow me into the final positions. The largest bunker complex on the southern peninsula sat 300 yards ahead. It was a triangle of concrete and hate, 3 pillboxes arranged in a mutually supporting wedge, heavily manned, bristling with machine guns. The Japanese had concentrated their remaining defenders in this final strong point, a last stand designed to bleed us dry. I checked the action on my bar, wiped the grit from the bolt, and checked my grenades. I looked at the Marines forming up around me. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, covered in a paste of sweat and coral dust. The last fight was about to begin. The triangle formation was the strongest Japanese defensive position on the southern peninsula, 3 pillboxes, each one covering the approaches to the other 2. It was a perfect kill box. There were approximately 30 soldiers divided among the 3 bunkers, plus a network of rifle pits and fighting holes connecting the positions like a spider web. Standard Marine doctrine called for a preparatory bombardment before assaulting a fortified position of this size. We should have had naval gunfire from the battleships offshore. We should have had air support screaming down from the clouds. At a minimum, we needed a barrage from the regiment's mortar platoon to shake them up. None of that was available. The naval guns had moved on to support operations elsewhere. The Marine Corsairs were busy strafing targets on the northern ridges. The mortar teams could not fire without hitting the Marines already advancing through the narrow corridor. 43 Americans would have to take the triangle with rifles, grenades, and sheer willpower. And one man who had already proven that concrete walls could not stop him. I organized the assault in less than 2 minutes. I didn't need speeches. I used hand signals, chopping the air, pointing at positions, and dividing the Marines into 3 groups. Each group would attack 1 pillbox simultaneously to split their defensive fire. I would take the center bunker, the largest one, the beast with the best fields of fire. We moved out at 0847. We had been fighting for over an hour without a break. The temperature had climbed past 105 degrees. The sun hammered down on us, reflecting off the white coral until the world seemed to be made of blinding light. Dehydration was becoming a factor. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in my mouth. Several men showed signs of heat exhaustion, stumbling, faces pale beneath the grime. They kept moving anyway. There was no other choice. I led my group of 12 Marines toward the center pillbox. The approach required crossing 60 yards of open ground. There was no cover, no concealment, just volcanic rock baked white by the Pacific sun. It felt like walking naked across a skillet. The Japanese opened fire when we were halfway across. The air snapped with the passage of rounds. 2 men fell in the first 3 seconds, 1 dead before he hit the ground, 1 screaming, clutching a leg that had been shattered. The remaining 10 kept running. They had learned from my earlier assaults. Speed was survival. Hesitation was death. You had to run through the fear. I reached the bunker wall first, my lungs burning, heart hammering against my ribs. I pressed my back against the rough concrete, smelling the damp, moldy scent of the interior wafting out. I pulled the pin on a captured Japanese grenade. The Type 97 had a 4 to 5 second fuse. It was unreliable, dangerous junk, but it was what I had. I banged the firing pin against the concrete to arm it, counted to 2, and threw the grenade through the firing slit. I ducked, pressing my face into the coral. The explosion shook the ground, silencing one machine gun, but the bunker was a monster. It had 2 firing positions. The second gun kept shooting, the rat-tat-tat vibrating through the wall against my spine. Marines outside were dying. I pulled another grenade, banged the pin, counted, and threw. Another dull explosion. The second gun went quiet. I didn't wait to see if they were dead. I climbed up the side of the bunker, boots scrambling for purchase on the concrete. I found the ventilation shaft on the roof. I shoved the muzzle of my bar into the opening and emptied my magazine into the darkness below. Screams echoed up through the concrete, human sounds that were quickly drowned out by the metallic clatter of the bolt locking back. Then silence. The center pillbox was dead. On my left, the first assault group had reached their target. A Marine corporal, brave as hell, had shoved a satchel charge through the firing slit. The explosion was massive, collapsing half the bunker's roof in a cloud of dust and debris. Japanese survivors stumbled out, stunned and bleeding, straight into Marine rifle fire. But on my right, the third group was struggling. Their pillbox had a reinforced entrance facing away from the Marine advance, protected by a blast wall. Japanese soldiers inside were throwing grenades faster than the Americans could close the distance. It was a stalemate, and stalemates killed Marines. I did not hesitate. I sprinted across the open ground between the bunkers. Bullets kicked up coral around my feet, little geysers of death. I felt a sharp, stinging slap on my thigh, like a whip crack. A round had grazed me. I ignored it. I kept running. I reached the third pillbox from its blind side, the same blind side that the other Marines couldn't approach because of the machine gun covering the approach. I scrambled up the side, finding the ventilation shaft. I had 2 grenades left. I dropped them both into the opening, one after the other. The twin explosions killed everyone inside. 3 pillboxes were destroyed in less than 4 minutes. The triangle had fallen. But I was bleeding. The bullet that grazed my thigh had cut deeper than I realized. I looked down and saw blood soaking my dungaree trousers, turning the fabric a deep, terrifying crimson. My left leg was weakening with every step, the muscle twitching uncontrollably. I looked south. The remaining 3 pillboxes stood between the Marines and complete control of the southern peninsula. I had killed approximately 50 Japanese soldiers, destroyed 9 bunkers, and been wounded at least once. The logical thing was to stop. The sane thing was to get medical attention, to lie down and let fresh Marines finish the job. I loaded my last magazine and started walking south. A Marine sergeant grabbed my arm, his grip tight. He pointed at the blood running down my leg, then pointed at the aid station established in a crater behind us. His eyes were wide, pleading. I pulled my arm free. I didn't say a word. I just pointed south. 3 pillboxes remained. I was not finished. The 10th pillbox fell at 0912. I killed its 5 defenders with grenades dropped through the ventilation shaft. The routine was grimly familiar now. Run, climb, drop, kill. My leg was still bleeding, the warm wetness squishing in my boot. I had wrapped a torn piece of dungaree fabric around the wound, tying it tight, but it was not enough. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage with every step, leaving a trail on the white rock. The 11th pillbox fell at 0921. This one required help. My ammunition was finally exhausted. A Marine private named Henderson ran up to me carrying a satchel charge like a football. He looked at my leg, then at my face, and nodded. I took the charge, placed it against the firing port, and pulled the igniter. The explosion killed 7 Japanese soldiers. The 12th pillbox was the last. It sat on a small rise overlooking the beach where the 7th Marines had landed 3 days earlier. The position had been firing on Marine supply parties since D-Day. Its 2 heavy machine guns had killed at least 15 Americans trying to bring us ammo and water. The bunker's commander had watched 11 pillboxes fall that morning. He knew he was next. He was waiting. I approached from the northeast. My leg had stopped responding properly. The nerves were shot. I was dragging it more than walking, my boots scraping heavily against the coral. Blood loss was affecting my vision. The edges of the world were turning gray. The coral ridges seemed to shimmer and dance in the 100-degree heat. 3 Marines followed me. They had refused to let me assault the final position alone. 1 carried extra grenades. 1 carried a flamethrower, the heavy tank strapped to his back. 1 carried a bar with ammunition to spare. The Japanese opened fire at 100 yards. The rounds snapped past my head. The Marine with the bar stepped out and returned fire, laying down a long, suppressive burst that forced the enemy gunners to duck behind their steel shutters. The other 2 and I kept moving. At 50 yards, the flamethrower operator stepped forward. The M2 flamethrower had an effective range of 40 yards. He needed to get closer. He needed 10 more yards of death ground. "Cover me!" he screamed. I took the bar from the supporting Marine. It felt impossibly heavy now, like lead. I shouldered it and fired in controlled bursts. The weapon kicked against my bruised shoulder. My wounded leg finally buckled under the recoil and the exhaustion. I dropped to one knee, the sharp coral biting into my skin, but I kept shooting. I kept their heads down. The flamethrower operator reached effective range. He braced himself and squeezed the trigger. A stream of liquid fire, burning napalm, arced through the air like a dragon's breath. It poured into the pillbox's firing slit. The screaming from inside lasted less than 10 seconds. It was a horrible, high-pitched sound that cut through the roar of the flames. At 09:33, the 12th pillbox fell silent. I tried to stand, but the world tilted sideways. I collapsed against a coral boulder, sliding down until I was sitting in the dust. My dungarees were soaked with blood from waist to ankle. My hands shook violently, a mix of total exhaustion and the crash of adrenaline leaving my system. The bar lay across my lap, the barrel still smoking, radiating heat that I could feel through my trousers. In approximately 90 minutes, I had destroyed 12 Japanese pillboxes and killed 50 enemy soldiers. I had broken the southern defensive line. I had kicked the door open for my platoon. I had changed the tactical situation on an entire sector of the island. But right then, staring at the burning bunker, I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt tired. Navy corpsmen reached me within minutes. I felt their hands on me, cutting away my blood-soaked trousers. The sun was directly overhead now, a white eye judging the carnage. "You're lucky, Marine," one of them said, his voice sounding far away. "Passed through the muscle, missed the bone and the artery." They dressed the wound, the pressure of the bandage sharp and grounding. I would keep my leg. That was good, because I knew with the certainty of a man who has looked into the abyss that the war wasn't over. I would heal, I would stand up, and I would keep fighting. 3 days later, still limping, I was back on the line. But for now, amidst the smell of sulfur and burning fuel, I closed my eyes and finally, for the first time that morning, I let myself breathe.